Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I'll talk about B10 River Leads. And if your reaction to this is, what is this? I've never seen that in my life. Does this really accomplish something? The answer is it comes up more often than you'd probably think, and it does accomplish something. There's quite a specific category of hands that really benefits from it, and I will explain that. Before I get into it, please consider subscribing. It's a new channel for me and I aim to do one video per month, and subscribers would really help and you get notified when the next video is out. Getting into the river leads, I'll start with an example of a hand that I recently played against a really good opponent probably. It was the highest stakes that I played because I satellited into it, and I played this hand 60 blinds deep early in the tournament. I opened from the hijack. Big blind calls. Here's the range in green that they're meant to call. And the flop came queen 5-4. And from the hijack, you can actually almost range bet this board. From the button, you have to do more checking. From the hijack, almost all the offsuited Broadway cards here connect with the queen at least a little bit. Even king 10 flops straight draw on many turns, still has an overcard. And then also the big blind defending range mixes folds here with 6-4 offsuit and stuff, so it connects a bit less with the 5-4 portion of queen 5-4, and they're meant to fold queen 5 and queen 4, and so you get to bet more often than you might think. Yeah, mostly for a small sizing. I didn't find the overbets here, or the big bets, P100 or whatever. I just bet small, and in the hand I had pocket sixes, which I bet here every time for a bit of value and protection. And then the big blind in the hand had 9-8 suited. A lot of players would just fold this, but I was up against a good player who noticed that they have to float me here some of the time with a hand as weak as 9-8 suited backdoor flush draw. So they found the call, turn was a 9, and they checked to me as they should with their entire range. I think they had 9-8 of diamonds in the hand, and I had pocket sixes. And on the turn I thought about what I want to do, and I thought it's a bit thin, but my hand really benefits from protection. And so I decided to go B80. I think, you could try to go something like B50 because that seems maybe more appropriate for what the hand is worth. But if you do that, a competent big blind might sniff out what you're doing and raise you thinly with, if they have pocket tens or even ace 9, they might, in a way ace 9 is better because it has more outs against the queen. So if they have ace 9, they might raise you if they sniff out what you're doing. So if I go B80, I think I could totally do that with a queen still. Don't always have to overbet on this turn, but a good queen wants to also overbet. But yeah, I try to be disguised with my sixes, but still go for value. Was it too thin? No. So as we see here in the solver, I can certainly do this with pocket sixes here. And I would also bet my turn 9x for the same reasons basically. And the sixes can even overbet as well, and then it gets more mergy. But even against the size that I chose, 7s and 8s from the big blind actually mix folds, which is quite a nice outcome. And the big blind calls pure with all their turned 9x, including the 9-8 suited here, 9-8 of diamonds that they had. The river was a brick, and you would probably think the big blind just checks everything to me, checks their 9-8 of diamonds because I was the aggressor on the previous street, and the 2 doesn't really improve a lot of their range. They don't hit 2 pair on this 2 a lot. But that's actually wrong, and the solver does lead B10 pure with this combo, and it makes a bit of added EV. And maybe that's not too much, but if the big blind had Jack 9 suited, just a little bit better, the added EV from betting instead of checking is actually getting quite high. So it's almost 0. It's almost 40% of one big blind. So that's quite significant and enough for me to want to look into what is going on in this spot. So here's the global shape of the big blind strategy on the river. And as we see, there's 30% of leading, and most of it is in this very small size B10, and that's what I'm going to look at here. So 25% of leading for B10, and quite a few hands want to do it pure. So here basically any strong 9x wants to do it pure, and that's the hand class that the lead is built around. And why does it happen? So there are two conditions for it to happen, and the first one is that here none of my bluffs, me being the hijack, improved on the 2 river, and so a lot of my range is either bluffs, or the second condition is that I had thin value bets on the turn that were sometimes value cutting themselves a bit against some of the calls, but overall they still accomplished enough to justify betting, getting called by some worse hand, maybe even folding out some better hands. But when these two conditions are met, then the big blind has this hand class here of strong 9x that is worth a little bit of extra money. It's ahead significantly more than 50% of the time, and there are these snap checked backs on the river by the hijack. For instance, my pocket sixes, which since they checked, I obviously just snap checked back and I lost the hand, but they missed out on this 10% of extra value. And so now we can do a little experiment. What if I had overbet the turn instead of bet B80? And the overbet is less mergy and also just stronger with the value hands. So if here I just filtered for overbet, and we can see there's still a bit of these pocket sixes, and 9-8 suited does it for probably getting some better 9x to fold that has a kicker that blocks too many of my bluffs, or is in an awkward spot on the river because also my straight draws improve. So there is a bit of merge betting, but it's just a lot less of it, and most of the value is just clear strong top pair or kings and aces. And against this turn betting range, there is hardly any B10 on the river. There is a little bit of it because when the solver calls with a draw here that has 0 showdown value, like this 7-6 of hearts with flush draw, turn flush draw, it wants to build a B10 betting range basically around this specific hand. So that's the only hand where the EV between betting and checking is not the same. And these other hands just get in there to help out the 7-6 suited. I think that's quite a sort of awkward play and can be quite transparent when no other hands benefit from doing it. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend carving out a B10 just for your awkwardly called draw out of position. But what's important here is that the B10 becomes a pure plus EV play for a much broader hand class than just these missed draws, if the second condition is also met. And this second condition is if the turn is not an overbet, but a bet that has quite a lot of thin value, that is planning on basically snap checking almost any river if we let them. Then you have this class of hands that wants to prevent them from snap checking the river and get a little bit of extra value. And so in the generalized form, instead of talking about hijack and big blind, this spot comes up more often, and the generalized conditions are none of in position's bluffs improved on the river, and in position had some thin value on the turn that they plan on checking back the river with always. And then, so the situation is that because out of position had to call a turn bet, they will be condensed to mostly showdown value, because you just can't really float draws without showdown value out of position very often. They have to be very strong draws to even consider doing that with, and then they can also obviously consider raising the turn. But if the river is such that in position doesn't improve, then they more than half their range will consist of either missed draws or these thin value planning to snap check on the river. And the hands that out of position now wants to get in this B10 donk bet, those are hands that when they face a river barrel, they are indifferent. They're indifferent about bluff catching. They're not excited, but they can certainly think about bluff catching. But they would be excited to go B10 because when they get called, they're almost always ahead, so they get this extra value. And that's the hand class that you want to build your B10 around. And so where else does this play show up? I stumbled upon this in a hand review of this like random hand, so I was thinking what other conditions would generate this play, and one thing I came up with is in blind versus blind we see a lot of so-called layered betting, by which I mean if the board has big gaps between board cards. So for instance, king 8-5, there's a big gap between the king and the 8 and sort of a big gap between the 8 and the 5. And then if the turn is say a blank, since ranges are so wide in blind versus blind, even if there's a king on the board, king 8-5, the 8 can still bet for value and protection, and maybe even some 5x on certain turns, especially if they have other things going for them, like a flush draw can maybe bet a middling sizing b50 or so for a bit of value and protection. And if this layered betting happens in wide range spots, then out of position is going to call with a showdown heavy range where these conditions apply, and they might find B10 leads on a lot of rivers. And then another condition I thought of, another scenario I thought of where this should happen is on turn cards that are so good for in positions range that they get to barrel almost their entire range again and then check rivers with their thinnest value. Like here on 10-5-3 rainbow king turn, the hijack can double barrel any strong 10 at least. And then they want to check back rivers with the 10. And I looked into these scenarios in the solver and found that yes, it's correct, and the B10 shows up really a lot in these scenarios. So I'll give some more examples here. So first, the blind versus blind example. I think this is going to be king 8-5 rainbow. So small blind here just calls, blind versus blind, and then big blind in this spot I made them check back. So they obviously isolate all their good stuff, but there's still some king jack left and suited high card with a low card, ace 9 offsuit, some of the best hands. And let's say the flop comes king 8-5, small blind, I made them check, and they mix with everything. So top pair checks roughly 40% of the time or so. 8x checks maybe half the time. And then big blind also still mixes with everything, but they do roughly 26% of betting here. And they can bet more if you simplify it to... Actually, there's more. There was a third size even that you don't see here. But if you simplify big blind to only bet one big blind, which I do, I'm not sure that's good to do 60 blinds deep, because 60 deep is so deep that maybe your best hand wants to get in money more quickly, but this is easier to play. People probably overfold blind versus one big blind. So this is a nice play. And if big blind bets just one big blind, they will get called or floated by quite a wide range. here I'm not showing the calling range, but turn being a 4, now we see what the small blind called with. So floating a lot of queen high with backdoor flush draws, but also just with overcards to the 5 has to float because it's a wide range spot. And then small blind checks on the turn pure, and here I made big blind bet again, and on the turn I would have a middling sizing like B60 and an overbet because the SPR is deep, and if you have a good hand, now is the time to get the money in. So overbet is certainly something to consider, especially with strong top pair or 2 pair, but sometimes you wanna also have this smaller bet. And the interesting thing about the B60 here is that the big blind uses a lot of value hands that is weaker than a king. And so here we see most prominently 8x, 8-7 offsuit, for instance, is using it more than half the time. 8-6 is basically going pure small bet here. And even a bit of 5x. So here it's only the 5x with the added flush draw, but then it can do it half the time. And ace-5 with the best kicker is just strong enough to maybe do it some of the time. And against this bet, the small blind actually still has these 9s through queens pocket pairs in their range, because remember they limped, mixed raises and limps pre-flop, and then the big blind check back, and when the flop comes a king, you're not really excited to raise with queens or jacks. So these are actually a meaningful portion of the range, and they always just pure call the turn against this B60. And then if the river is a blank, as you would expect from the theme of this video, the small blind does a lot of donk betting B10, and in this scenario, the overpairs to the 8, pocket pairs under the king, are the ones that the play is mostly built around. But then also something like ace-8 offsuit is certainly strong enough and really benefits from getting called by verse 8x and by this like 5x suited of hearts for this 10% of thin value. And as you can see, these hands, many of them have a pure preference and make added EV over checking. And here we see the big blind's response. So the big blind still does a lot of raising because, yeah, almost any king, or at least king 9, is starting to want to raise for value, because the leading range is really built mostly around hands that are between the 8 and the queen. 8 and pocket queens is what I mean. So they do still a lot of thin value raising, but they also do a bit of folding, even though it's only 10% of the pot. And the hands that want to fold the most is hands with a 6 or a 7, because they block like that one no showdown value bluff that is behind almost everything. The 7-6 here, I think it can be also offsuit, since the turn bet was quite small and it was a weak wide range spot, but also 7-6 of hearts if it hadn't raised would be in there. And then the check 9 off and 10-9 off here, they fold and they don't want to raise, I think, because they block the region where these thin B10 value bets by the small blind come from. And so you don't want to block hands that consider folding to the raise, so those hands can't really raise, and the raises are more from hands like 10-3 that has only one card blocking pocket 10s, pocket 9s, pocket queens, pocket jacks. And so the less you block that region of hands, the more you want to consider bluff raising. And yeah, and you have some folds, but the solver here even makes a hero call with 10 high, not having a 7 or a 6 in the hand is just good enough to sometimes call. On what other rivers is there B10 leading in this particular spot? And actually, we will see that it shows up on almost any river. And the reason here is that blind versus blind, the ranges are so wide, especially in a limp check pot, that the ranges weren't even filtered more pre-flop. Then now the bluffs are pulled from all over the place. And so on any specific river, just not a lot of bluffs improved. And that's why the small blind gets to lead basically on every single river. And there's one exception. You can briefly pause the video if you want and try to answer what is the specific river where there is no leading. And the answer is when the 8 pairs, because on the turn, most of the big blind's thin value bets came from an 8 that saw a bit of value and protection. And so the 8 is kind of the main target where the B10 gets its value from always. And if the 8 pairs, then that helped the big blind too much, and the small blind has less of an incentive to lead. And then other board pairing rivers, they're actually similar to bricks, and or maybe they're like a bit better for the small blind than a brick, because the small blind then makes trips a bunch on these low cards. And so they get to lead a lot on other board pairing rivers. And on unpairing rivers, so there's least leading on a 9 on a 10, but still some. And there's more leading again, just like on a brick, on a 2 or 3, on a check or a queen or an ace. And the reason here is just that on specifically a 10 river, the small blind didn't float turns with a 10 high card very often. Because, for instance, 10x suited in hearts has no showdown value, so it would be awkward to call a turn, so instead it raises. And that's why on the 10, the only hands that really want to do the B10 lead is here queens, jacks can do it, and then some of king x gets in there, but we just don't have a lot of hands like queen 10 suited is maybe the only one, or maybe ace 10 suited, but as we see here, jack 10 suited would have raised at some point earlier in the hand, or 10-9 suited, same. And off-suited 10x hand just had to fold, they're not strong enough. But if the turn is a queen, then we have more flush draws here. Queen x suited of hearts has just enough showdown value that it can call turns instead of raising them, so our turned queen x now goes for the B10 river lead alongside these other ace 8 offsuit, maybe still strong enough. Even jack 8 offsuit can mix it, but the ones that go pure here are just the turned queen x, rivered queen x. And then lastly, on an ace, it's interesting that we see so much leading in that king x can still lead, even though an overcard came against the king. But the reason here is that the big blind on the turn doesn't really want to bluff with an ace, because it's just too strong. It has too much showdown value, and it kind of value owns itself when it bets. And so because the big blind almost never has an unpaired ace that hits the river, king x is still strong enough to go for the lead. And why does a rivered ace only lead b10 instead of b33? So you can see here there's a bit of b33 leading, but it mostly just wants to stay in there to protect the king x from raises. The big blind makes quite a lot of 2-pair on this river, and in general has some 2-pair in the range. So, and we also just don't benefit too much from going larger than b10, because the b10 mostly targets 8x and 5x with hearts, and we don't get all that much value. If we were to go B33, then those hands can already fold and we don't get paid more. And so after seeing how often this comes up, blind versus blind, in these wide range spots, we can also think about where would it definitely not show up. And so boards where there's less layer betting, so tightly connected boards where the cards are closer to each other, like queen, jack, 8, 5 something, or queen, 10, 9, 7, where all the cards are close together, there you won't see this play. And also you won't see it on dry boards where there just aren't that many pairs to call and protection bet to begin with. So yeah, we're looking for spots where the gaps are big between board cards, and we're looking for turn sizings where the sizing tells us that there's some thin value on the turn that will want to snap check rivers. And the big takeaway here for me is that we want to pay attention on the turn already. So the turn is the stage where you want to notice the nature of the spot and prepare for potential leads on the river. So be on the lookout for what kind of river it's going to be. And in spots that aren't very wide range, so in spots where in positions bluff are quite defined to, over cards to the top pair, for instance, then we're looking for brick rivers when thinking about where to lead B10 on the river. However, in these blind versus blind, really wide range spot, in positions bluffs can be so all over the place that B10 shows up on almost any river, given the right board with this layered big betting, big gaps between cards, and the right turn action where there's enough there's enough thin value in there on the turn. And now I'll talk briefly about the range composition that you should aim towards for the B10 River Lead. The most important part is to not miss it with the hand class that does want to do it pure. So the hands that it's built around, as we said, hands that are indifferent against a river barrel, but they're excited about the extra value from going B10. Then you also want to go pure with your very worst hands, the awkwardly called draws that missed. And you shouldn't have too many of those because, again, it's awkward to call no showdown value draws out of position. Then this is more of a solver play and kind of difficult to execute, so that's why I put it in parentheses. But to prevent the opponent from calling everything that doesn't block your bluffs, so making really many of these 10 high hero calls and just calling almost everything. The solver also includes a bit of leading with 0 EV hands that are ahead roughly half the time when they get called. So this would be something like bottom pair, or sometimes even ace queen high, or even ace 7 offsuit that matches the bluffs that you have, the 7-6 straight draws. And I say use at your own discretion, because if you get the hand class slightly wrong here, sometimes you think these bluffs are 50% equity, but then it's more like 45, and you actually value own yourself doing it, or you pick bad blockers, unblockers, or whatever. And this is more of a balance play, and I'm not sure it's necessary to do it, but I just wanted to mention that the solver does this. But then a hand class that is more important to have in there is if you were to only go B10 with hand classes with a hand that is indifferent to a river value raise, then your opponent can exploit that and go very thin for value and value raise any top pair, or even a bit thinner, like in the example that we had earlier on, it was a queen eye board, I believe. Yeah, on this queen 5-4 9 2 river board, they could value raise any ace 9 if V from the big blind are capped to strong 9x for the B10 River Lead. So to prevent our opponent from going really thinly for value, we have to also mix in top pair for top pair and top pair plus, basically, so better than top pair, sometimes in our B10 River leading range. And I would say as a crude heuristic, just do that maybe half the time. And then if you're in a spot where you have fewer hands that want to benefit from B10, so for instance on the King 8-5 rainbow and then the turn is a 10, since you weren't calling a lot of 10x, you only really want to do the B10 lead like with queens for as a pure play, maybe ace 8 and maybe this like very rare ace 10 suited, ace queen 10 suited of hearts that could float the turn with a bit of showdown value. If you know that your B10 value range is quite thin, then you don't have to do it 50% with top pair plus. You only do it maybe 25% or so. So yeah, and since we were talking about range composition, I just showed the B10 river spot again here on a brick. Here we see the hands that do it basically pure. And then we see some of these weird zero EV plays like ace-6 offsuit or ace-queen suited here that I don't necessarily recommend copying, but you can think about it. And then there is a bit of top pair plus and top pair doing it for protecting you from getting exploited by thin value races. And here on the other board, hijack versus big blind, it's the same concept, but here the B10 leads come all around 9x, and then top pair does it again half the time for balance and top pair plus. And thinking about it in exploitative terms, how do we think B10 will come across? So I would think some bad players might freeze and under raise because they get a bit, uneasy about what's going on. But then good players probably won't under raise per se because they know they have to raise a lot against small sizings for value. But what the play can do is it can remind them of the fact that all their bluffs missed. Because if someone sees a lead, they may not immediately know what it's about, but then they will think about the spot and think, well, none of my bluffs improves. Sometimes that's a reason for out of position to lead. So maybe I'm not meant to fire again with every bluff here. So that's the sort of thinking process that I expect will go on in a reg who faces this play for the first time. So they're less likely to over raise you by accident, I would say, when they see B10. But then they might still level themselves into raising too much. So they might think, well, maybe even though none of my bluffs improves, maybe it looks like, this player has something that they don't want to see themselves getting raised, so maybe I should raise her. So you get into this spot where it's easy for people to level themselves, but maybe also they don't level themselves, and then it's kind of hard to, what do you do if you get raised and you have like one of these awkward bluff catchers? But remember that if you check, you might also face a big bet, so it's kind of the same. And the B10 straight up makes EV for an entire hand class, so I would say it's worth implementing. And yeah, if you check, you might face a bet anyway, and I would say start doing it and gather experience about what people will raise you with. And if you find that you almost never get raised when you do it, maybe you want to do it even more with certain hands. Yeah. But also maybe you want to do it less with top pair then and use top pair still to bluff catch. And now playing on the other end, so if you're in position and you face a B10 on the river, some heuristics for that. So make sure to still go for value. With these very small bets, B10 or sometimes B15, a good heuristic is to essentially treat it as a check. But you do have to fold some hands. So obviously against a check, you're never folding. You mostly treat it as a check, but you fold your very worst hands and bad hands that block. They're like the one draw that missed. And I had here the recommendation that maybe you go 1 to 2 pips tighter for value with racing as compared to what you would do against a check. But I'm not even sure, and I think you don't want to go 2 pips tighter, because the ranges that I looked at is when you face a check, the solver did use B10 with some of the range, so the check is probably weaker than if someone doesn't have B10 River Leads in their toolkit. So when you look at how thinly you can value bet on the river in the solver scenario, this is meant to be, against a range that's weaker than it would be against a real life opponent who never finds the B10. And so this kind of evens itself out. And for that reason, I think you want to go at most 1 pip tighter. And even that is maybe not even necessary. And I think you can largely treat it as a check, maybe go 1 pip tighter for value. And then there's some 10 high hero calls in there on some boards, but most of the 10 high obviously folds, and only consider hero calls when you don't block their bluffs. And then for bluff raises, the hand selection is that you want to unblock the hand class that the B10 is mostly built around, because those hands are indifferent to your raises. And so you want to make it more likely that the big blind led with some of these hands that are indifferent to the raise, rather than with a top pair that they will almost always call against the raise. I mean, it depends on the size of the raise, but when big blind leads with top pair in that spot, they're not really planning on folding it, although, some of their weakest top pairs will mix a bit of folds if the raise gets big. Yeah, here we see the reaction again. Obviously 2 pair go all in, and then King X with good kicker almost always raises, and bluff raises wanna unblock the, in this specific example, is the 9s through queens region that you want to unblock, because those hands are in an awkward spot against the raise. And now we're almost at the end of the presentation. I just will click through 2 more solves where the concept also come up to show you that it happens in more spots than just the 2 spots we looked at. So first spot is a blind versus blind spot. And so in this spot, we're 50 deep, small blind calls, big blind raises to 3.5x, small blind calls the ISO raise, and then the flop, again, big gaps between cards, queen 9, 6. Small blind range checks, even though I would say they hit the board sort of well. The defense here starting with the offsuited 8x region. But small blind plays no leads, so they check. And then here I will make the big blind check back for once, so we see a spot where the betting only starts again on the turn. So big blind checks. Turn is, say, a 4, bringing 1 flush draw. The small blind now wants to get money in, mostly with their top pair, but sometimes they check it too. And then on the turn, because the turn didn't really change anything and the big blind checked the flop, there is not a lot of betting, because big blind already has bet a lot of their top pair. But there is still a bit of betting with top pair that the big blind initially slow played, and those hands then want to go big, so there's a bit of over betting. And then after facing two checks, maybe now the big blind now thinks most of their 9x is maybe good enough to get a bit of protection. Even hands like pocket sevens can go for value and protection. So if I isolate this sizing here, which is 60% pot, it's not super frequent, but we see it's what sort of hands it's built around, and it's 9x pocket sevens, 6x of spades. Yeah, it's quite similar to those spot we looked at. Then the small blind calls, and river, if the river is a blank, we now see that the small blind does leading for B10 here with their 9x, queen x. And since this is again a blind versus blind spot, ranges are so wide that it's not just on the brick that we see the leads, but also if the river is a king, the small blind actually floats king x on the turn a bunch, especially since some of these have straight draws and some showdown value, so that there's even more B10 leading on a king river, and same concept on the ace river. And now the second example is a high check versus big blind spot. Big blind calls, checks on 10-5-3 rainbow, and the high check has a range bet here. Over pairs right above the 10 mostly want to bet big, but queens does a bit of small betting too. And then ace 10 mostly wants to bet big, but weaker 10x mixes small bets as well. So if the hijack bets small on the flop, big blind calls, and then the turn is a king, big blind has to check and hijack. The king is so good for the hijack's range. So the hijack opened all this offsuited Broadway region where everything either hit a 10 or has two overcards to the 10, and then they either make like strong straight draws or top pair on the king turn. So there's really not a lot of checking by the hijack on the turn. The checking is all built around sixes through nines that are just a bit too weak to bet. But any decent 10 can bet a second time here for value. Sometimes even use the overbet for a bit of deception in there. Maybe some mergy properties with some of the 10s, but mostly the 10 goes into this smaller sizing, a bit smaller than the overbet, so here B80. And when we do that in the solver and the big blind calls, if the river is a brick like an 8 here, we see that the big blind has B10 leads quite a lot, and queen 10 here is just about good enough to use for the lead, even though it might sometimes value cat itself against queens or king x, but it gets called by enough worse hands that this is worth it. I would imagine even some ace jack and ace queen definitely has to call because it's just a b10 and we'd be massively overfolding, so this really gets enough value. And then some of the king x gets in there for protecting the range, balancing it. And so if we look at the hijack's response, yeah, the hijack doesn't have a lot of really weak hands. They have a bit of 9-7 suited, but some of the weakest hands is queen high here, so they have to fold pure. But then, yeah, ace jack has to mix calls. And they have to find some bluff raises here. And the value threshold appears to be roughly king jack here. And surprisingly, king 9 is not strong enough. So now to give a quick summary, again, the B10 river leads happen when The following two conditions are met. None or few of in position's bluffs improved on the river, and secondly, in position had thin value bets on the turn that we're planning on snap checking rivers if we let them. And then the B10 leads are built around the following hand class, so hands that are indifferent to face another river bet, but they get excited when they can go B10 to get some extra value. But to balance our B10 and not only have hands in there that will feel awkward against a raise, we also add top pair plus, and obviously we have to bluff because otherwise they can just fold too much. So we add draws that missed or these like weak hands that are 50-50 when they get called. And I think to find this play, you really have to pay attention on the turn already. So on the turn, your job is to notice the nature of the spot, notice that you're facing a range with thin value bets, some of which you're ahead of with portions of your range. And that's when you should prepare for looking at the river and deciding whether you have a B10 leading range. And for playing against it, you do want to fold some hands in every spot when you face B10, but not that many, not many at all. And then still raise your value, maybe go one pip tighter compared to what you would bet versus a check. And yeah, so now that you know, good luck raising some eyebrows with this river donk lead.